You are listening to Sambandh, the Royal Norwegian Embassy's podcast, where we unpack Norway-India relations.
Are we seeing a shift in the way India looks at Europe? What are the complementarities between India and Norway? And what is a common misconception about Norway? My name is Nora Dokken Harboe, and I work at the political team at the Norwegian Embassy in New Delhi. And joining me today is a friend of Norway and someone uniquely positioned to answer these questions. Suhasini Haider, diplomatic editor at The Hindu, one of India's most respected voices on foreign policy and global affairs. Suhasini was just in Norway covering the India-Nordic Summit, which provides a perfect backdrop for today's conversation. Suhasini, it's an honor to have you on the podcast. Welcome.
Thank you, and thank you for including me on what seems to be a really interesting idea, of public diplomacy.
Yes, I think it's a very good way to showcase a little bit more about the great relationship that we have between India and Norway. So maybe you can start off by explaining to us a little bit about your relationship with Norway and the first time you were there, maybe.
Certainly, and I have to say that, journalists are normally on the opposite side of diplomats. So how we see relations is not always the same, and we look for interesting news, not always the least controversial kind of news. But if you were to ask me about Norway and what one thinks of the two countries, I think we don't realize India and Norway could not be more different in terms of size, in terms of weather, in terms of outlook. But they both share the same brand, and that is peace. I mean, India's biggest brand globally, I think, is Mahatma Gandhi. And I think for Norway, it's the Peace Prize. So in a sense, there is something there that is a very, very deep chord that is in common between the two. I've been to Norway more than twice now. I've been there 3 times. And I visited originally as part of the Oslo Forum, which is, for those who don't follow that, a sort of track 1+2 meeting on conflict resolution. And so some of the top minds who deal with conflicts, as well as the actual actors, ministers, heads of state that come together in Oslo once a year to speak about the big challenges and also about how to resolve challenges, how conflicts are resolved. And as a journalist who's covered a lot of conflict, it's been very interesting for me. So that was my first introduction to Norway. Of course, you can't help but be captivated by the beauty of the place and of just nature everywhere around you. And then to go for the Prime Minister Modi's visit for the Nordic Summit, as well as for bilateral meetings in Oslo, was particularly interesting. I think we had quite a lot of stories to file. There was a lot of news being made. And we actually got to see quite a lot of how it works, and not just how Norway works, but also all the other countries that were part of the Nordic Summit.
So as our listeners can hear, Suhasini is already a very good friend of Norway and has been there several times. So if you would pick one word to describe Norway, what will that be?
Peaceful?
Peaceful?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, I think that's what you feel when you're over there. There's a certain amount of calm. It's
and it's interesting that you say that about nature, because that is also a little bit the idea of our peace and reconciliation efforts. Is that it might maybe seem a bit naive to some, but we have this belief that if we put people with different opinions in a peaceful place just outside of Oslo, and they can sit down for a couple of hours and they can speak and they can have waffles, everyone will be able to find common ground, even people that you will not imagine to do that in the first place.
I think Norway and South Asia may not seem like very connected, but I think since I've started covering the region, one has always known that Norway has an extra interest in South Asia, whether it was the peace process in Sri Lanka, which wasn't very popular in India, I have to say, at the time, or it's been with Afghanistan. So Norway's had a very specific interest and opinion in South Asia. But I think what you're pointing to is a very important idea, Nora, that we may not be able to resolve conflict, but as long as we believe that there is a place for dialogue, we ensure that the next day is not as hopeless as the previous one. I mean, I think that's the difference. I think even when you see today's very, very fraught conflicts, including the one between the US and Iran, the idea that nearly through most of this conflict, they have also had talks. I mean, even before the conflict, they were in talks. Kind of reminds you that things are not as hopeless as they seem. And I think as a result, what the Oslo Forum does is remind you that people who really have seen their loved ones die and at the hands of the other side are still able to sit down at a table with the other side simply because they want to ensure that tomorrow is better than yesterday.
No, I think you're very right, and also moving to the other thing that you talked about already about the recent visit of Prime Minister Modi to Norway for the India-Nordic Summit, because that was, of course, also one of the reasons why we wanted to invite you for this podcast, because you were one of the Indian journalists who were there the whole time during the bilateral meeting and during the India-Nordic meeting. So what were your main takeaways from your recent visit to Norway?
Well, I think it was a very, very productive visit from both sides. And I think the Indian side went away feeling that they had achieved a new understanding of Norway and vice versa, as well as of the Nordic countries, and why we need to do more to work together, because it's no secret that we really don't know much about each other. We are strangers getting to know each other. I think the EFTA agreement in the last few years has gone a long way in sensitizing and informing the two sides about each other. But there's no question this was the first prime ministerial visit in decades. And I think that itself, the fact that you show up is the first step in a certain sense. I think there was a real attempt to try and find the complementarities. Because again, if you're very different countries, you're not going to really have talks about what you can do in terms of together the same. It would have to be things that I can do that you can't, and you can do that I can't. And so we saw a little bit of those conversations, which was interesting. The meeting of, say, technology and skill. The meeting of, say, a certain type of energy conversation, and the possibility of scale that India provides.
Exactly, because I think there's a lot of complementarities here that the Nordic countries may have the expertise in different technology, like niche technology within the green industry, for example. But then India has the huge market to offer, and also talent. And I think that is increasingly something that we're not lacking talent in Norway and the Nordic countries, but we are small populations compared to.
And there's only so much you can do as long as labor, manpower is a crunch. I mean, is you can see around Europe actually. Even though I know that there is in many parts of Europe a sort of resistance to immigration or migrants, at the end of the day, migrants are fulfilling a certain space. How do you get over the resistance? And I think Norway and India were some of the first conversations we had on mobility, where the idea is that you're not migrating, you are moving for a job. And the host country helps to sensitize you, to educate you in the language, to ensure that you have health care, in a way so that it's a seamless journey for that person who comes and adds value, say in a country like Norway, but then goes back and is able to create a life for themselves back home in India. Which is also, a smooth transition back. So I think, ideas like this, there's never one final idea for anything, but ideas like this, which Norway and India have been part of the conversation on, I think show a way to, the sense I get from a lot of the conversations I hear between the two countries is that they are able to think out of the box, that they are able to say, let's break it down to the basics, see what we need, and then move on. Which is why I said the EFTA negotiations was interesting, because there were very, very tough issues, areas where both sides have very serious sensitivities, like human rights, like immigration, like dairy products. And yet they were able to work them through and find ways to step aside from the problems between them. So I think that's what came through in the visit as well. And I think it was a window into the kind of regionalism that perhaps we don't have yet in our part of the world. We are a very clear region, South Asia, and within that region there are many sub-regions as well, but we don't have the kind of ease of meeting and cooperation on a regional scale that I think Nordic countries do, or even the European Union does. And I think that was very interesting to see, the easy conversations between the leaders there, the fact that cooperating between the Nordic countries is quite seamless. That's something I think we could learn a lot from.
And what can Norway learn from India?
I think dealing with chaos, having resilience, being able to see through problems. And I'm very proud of the fact that India is able to do that. That when people say a country that has such a large population of poor people, or certainly the per capita GDP, it puts India quite low on the list, is still a country that is able to innovate, that is still a country that is able to have a smile on its face mostly, and also to be resilient through change. I'll give you a small example. Norway is not dealing as well as it should with the heat, because you're just not used to it.
With the heat wave now.
Yeah, because you're just not used to it. I mean, I've been to Norway on trips where I've literally been shocked that people are, sitting in the heat, but not that there aren't fans and air conditioners in that sense. That's something that in India, within 3 days, somebody would have innovated and ensured that, people wouldn't have to, worry about something like the heat. So I just feel that there is a need for that kind of ability to be dynamic, to change. In India, of course, you'll hear that word again and again called jugaad.
I was just thinking about it. I didn't remember the word, so thank you for reminding me.
So I think if there is something, and I'm just not to be boastful here, if there is something that Norway could learn from India, I think that would be it.
I think you're very right, and we are not used to the chaos and so many people. We're not used to also things getting a bit out of control, and I think we need to learn from that from India. But Prime Minister Modi's visit to India was part of a broader visit to Europe. He was in the Netherlands, in Sweden, in Italy, and he returned to Europe in June also for the G7 summit in France, and for a bilateral visit to Slovakia. Has this changed during your time as a foreign correspondent? Has it changed the way that India is looking at Europe as a strategic partner?
Nora, I would say that yes, it has changed. I don't think there's a question, and I think 2026 may well be remembered as the year of Europe and India, because you pointed out all the prime minister's visits abroad, but there's also all the incoming visits. We saw, European leaders coming to Delhi through the last few months. Also, the EU top leadership in Delhi in January for the big summit. Possibly, if there is an EU-India deal. After the EFTA as well was signed, that Prime Minister Modi will go back to Europe later this year. There's no question that there is a sudden, looking through a lot of smog and seeing just each other right now between India and Europe. I think there's a certain, right now, romanticism attached to the relationship, because we're not part of the problems for each other. We could be part of solutions for each other, but that's a little way away right now. So I do think that there's no question that there's a shift in the way India and Europe are seeing each other and are working on ways to do more. And here you have to say, yes, there's the EU bloc, there's the Nordic bloc, there are also the NATO bloc sort of relations, although those are very nascent with India right now. We're not on that security front as much. I think it also comes from geopolitical factors. And so we have to understand that maybe the moment is pushing us together. The year began with the Canadian Prime Minister making that speech at Davos, where he spoke about middle powers needing to come together and putting that sign in the window to say, enough is enough. And a sort of kind of counter to the big global powers and how they're behaving. So I think there's no question that even before all the problems we've seen in the last few months with the war in Iran, that already countries were beginning to get very fatigued and wary of how the global superpowers were behaving, whether it was the US, whether it was Russia, whether it was China, on strategic fronts, on security fronts, as well as on economic fronts. I think that moment is also pushing India and Europe together. The third, I think, is there is an ability right now to understand each other's problems. As I said earlier, there are certain issues that are sensitive to both that have really held up cooperation in the past. India's insistence that our migrants must be treated in a certain way and have recourse to citizenship paths and all the rest used to be one of the non-negotiables. Human rights issues on the European side, and we've always seen the European side raising these human rights issues very openly. That's been a bit of a thorn for the Indians. But I've seen in the last few years an ability or a political decision, to put these ideas in their own boxes and to deal with them not as an entirety of the relationship. And that's what's allowed the relationship to move forward.
Wasn't it Yashankar who said, Foreign Minister Yashankar, who said that we are looking for partners, not preachers? And
well, I would say it should go both ways. And the truth is as well that that there should be an understanding on both sides that neither of us want double standards. We want the same standard that you would give all partners.
Yeah, no, definitely. And how do you think the Nordic countries fits within this shift, if we call it a shift, moving towards Europe?
I think there are three parts to where the Nordic-India relationship as a part of the Europe-India relationship stands out. One is, I don't think there's a question that business is driving this. In the old days, we would talk about political meaning to a relationship before we looked at the trade. And in fact, trade and business were supposed to follow. The truth is, they are drivers of this relationship, because on one side you have countries that have the technology, that have already made their manufacturing processes efficient, but they don't have the land and the space and the people and the skilled manpower that is willing to do some of the tasks. And therefore, there is already a way of looking at each other. There's also a real search for markets. Unfortunately, the world has moved in a direction where every year on year, I wouldn't say it as a capitalist thing, but the idea that market-driven economies are always looking for new markets. So in a sense, both sides are looking at each other for markets as well. So that's one part. I think climate change is definitely the other. That the Nordic countries have captured this moment when it comes to climate change much quicker than perhaps others. Maybe you felt it more because you're right there at the Arctic, and Nordic countries began to realize the effects of global warming much quicker than others. So I do think that they are much further ahead than so many other parts of the world when it comes to the technology to cope and deal with a lot of the climate change. Again, that's something that needs to be built to scale. It needs to be used. It needs to be spread. Again, India is in that place to do it. And I think the third has to be on people to people. And again, I said mobility is one way. But it's also about societies getting to know each other. And it is even conceivable, and who knows in the future, that we can have those tough conversations. Because this is something I always say, that real friendships are not built on need. Real friendships are built on trust and also on honesty between the two. So if human rights and press freedoms and minority rights are important in in both our countries, then we need to be able to have conversations on those. And I think that's when societies actually start working together, when you have that level of friendship.
And do you think we're getting there in terms of trust?
Well, I think trust, definitely. I think there is a feeling that we are no longer expecting to be shocked by the other. And we are being shocked by a third other. So maybe that's one of the drivers in the relationship. But I think in terms of honesty, we've still got a very long way to go. And that's just as a journalist, I feel that we haven't yet had the very tough conversations between us. For example, Europe has its modern day history of an alliance with the US as one of the poles in the world. And it has a history of trade with China. In the last few years, that's been ruptured because of the behavior of these two countries. But what happens if there's a perfectly rational government in Washington and there is suddenly an economically fair and just dispensation in Beijing? Will this relationship then lose some of that sort of need for each other? I think those kind of questions do raise whether we trust each other just yet.
That's interesting. And I was also, because now we have been talking a lot about how India is looking to Europe, but I think also definitely that Europe is looking to India. I mentioned all the outgoing visits, but you, of course, it's also very important to mention all the incoming visits and all the signing of the new trade deals. You already mentioned the one we are not part of. Norway is not part of the EU, part of the EFTA. And we signed a free trade agreement with India about 2 years ago, and it came into force last October. It was
one of the first, yeah.
Exactly. So it's not only India looking to Europe; it's also Europe looking to India. Would you agree to that?
I think so. I think we've seen a really large number of visits. Some of it is based around events. So we saw in the AI summit in Delhi in February, a large number come. Also in March, when the Finland president was here for Raisina, the conversations around Raisina, which is the Ministry of External Affairs' annual convention. So we've seen a lot of incoming visits and so many leaders wanting to have the conversations, try and get to know India a little more. We're also seeing a lot more of incoming visitors going to other parts of the country. So I know the Norwegian ambassador has been in Andhra Pradesh, for example, or in the south looking at things very diverse like renewable energy units and the whole cause of building footpaths and urban facilitation. So I think that has been one of the big changes too, that we're seeing much more of European leaders coming, but then going to other parts of India, not just making this a G2G conversation. Particularly in the south, I think there are a lot of areas.
But then I think you have answered the questions already, or the question already, but just to emphasize it, it's not only an economic shift that we're seeing, it's also a strategic shift.
Well, you'll pardon me for saying it right now, but maybe in a while it will be a strategic shift. I think at the moment, Europe and India are checking each other out, shall we say, before making the strategic dive. I know Europe does have its own Indo-Pacific policy. India is a part of the observer at the Arctic Council. There are a lot of ways in which, in terms of defense, hardware, equipment, sharing, co-production. There are all kinds of conversations going on. But I think a strategic shift requires a much greater understanding of each other's threats. We're not in that place. At the moment, Europe's big threat is from Russia, or certainly Europeans feel it comes from Russia. That's not a big threat for India at all. In fact, one of the areas of friction between us has often been that Europe doesn't understand how India engages with Russia. India has similar concerns over Europe's partnerships, particularly in our region. So I think when that strategic shift happens, we shouldn't use the words too loosely or they lose meaning, because a strategic shift is a real shift in terms of going together and in terms of linking our militaries together or linking our strategic visions together. Right now, we're at the place where I think, as I said, we're not part of the problems for each other. And on certain issues, whether it is free trade, whether it is on climate change, countering climate change, whether it is on the need to regulate new technology, I think Europe and India are much closer to each other than any two parts of the world, because we're not seeing that same commitment to global self-regulation in any other part. It's a bit concerning in India, and I think you may have seen in the AI summit that India kept pushing for the conversation, perhaps on a little bit of regulation, a little bit of checks, which was anathema to the rest of the world, but I think European countries understood that. So I think in those areas, we're working much closer together. We're working on convergences, but I wouldn't call it a strategic shift just yet.
You mentioned Russia, and I just want to go back to that because I think or my understanding at least, is that there is an increased understanding by Indian side why this is so existential to Europe. And that doesn't mean that India cannot have the relationship that they have with Russia. But I think there is definitely, you see an increased understanding, and maybe also the other way around for problems, or you mentioned that we have different problems, and I think counterterrorism is one of the issues where there is also maybe more understanding on the European side. So there is a possibility to become closer by understanding each other's problems, I think.
Certainly. And you're absolutely right that when you make a political decision to come closer together, then you will make the statements that are sensitive to each other, and you will be more aware of the other's concerns. And I hope that that's the direction that we are seeing right now. But I do want to flag it as one area for a possible, challenge in the future. Because if you don't have that understanding, that political understanding to be able to put the sensitive issues in their rightful place, you can easily be disappointed with a relationship. This is not the first time Europe and India have come together on certain issues in the past, but often it has happened and then that moment has passed, and then we start looking elsewhere or we get busy. I don't think Europe and India, in fact, there is so much in common. If you were to see Europe as a federation of democratic, pluralistic countries, progressive countries, and India trying to be a federation of 30 odd states with different languages and different cultures and all the rest. I think there's a lot you can see in terms of why we understand each other, why we understand that Europe's foreign policy or for the Nordic countries as well, that there's a lot more interest in consensus than there would be in some of the other big countries that are ruled from one idea. So I do think that we have a lot in common that we could build on. And I certainly hope we're working towards understanding each other on certain issues because, you spoke about Russia, so I'll speak freely and say that I think in Europe there was really not an understanding when India originally refused to condemn Russia's invasion of Ukraine. That was something that I think European countries, because we had 12 European leaders come one after the other to Delhi to try and change India's position, and they didn't. I don't think there's any more understanding of that today than there was at that time, but there's an understanding that India is going to stay put. Similarly, for India, it was a huge shock when Europe brought sanctions on Russia, which essentially meant that food, fuel, and fertilizers all were going to be in short supply for India, and India had to suddenly start looking around to see how it could diversify those lines. And again, as I said, I don't think there's a greater understanding on why there needs to be these sanctions, but I think there is now an acceptance in India that Europe cares as much, or European countries, particularly those closer to the Russian border, feel strongly enough about the issue so that we are sensitized to it.
Yeah, no, you're right. It's existential for us. Norway also shares a border with Russia, so of course this is a huge security threat for us. But I think we can conclude on that there is definitely a shift towards more collaboration between India and Europe, but there is still some way to go, and more collaboration can still happen. So maybe we can close this episode by you explaining to us a little bit about what can be a common misconception about Norway from the Indian side.
Well, I think the idea that Norway is essentially just a country that has a lot of darkness because it's near the pole, and that it's sort of very sort of gloomy, and is the opposite of what you see when you go there, because it's so green and the lakes are just beautiful. And while I haven't had the good fortune of seeing the Northern Lights yet, everything I've heard about them is spectacular. So I think that's one part of it. I think the other is this idea that Norway is somehow remote, because everyone that I have met from Norway or in Norway has always been very concerned about what's happening in the world, what's happening in our region, what's happening. So they are actually much more involved and invested in a kind of global idea than perhaps a lot of other countries in the region.
Thank you. Suhasini, it has been lovely to have you on the podcast. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Nora. Thanks for having me.